put your stuff down. Thank you so much for making it out on a Saturday. We'll get started. Thank you. Yes, there are charts with prompts on them to get us warmed up. Welcome, everybody. We'll get started in a minute or two. Thanks. All right, welcome everyone. We'll get started now. So if you want to just take a deep breath, get comfortable. My name is Gia Lee. I'm a New York City public school teacher with a movement of rank and file educators. Make some noise. I'm really, really honored to be helping to moderate, facilitate today's event. Super grateful for Joe Burns for coming all the way out here. Let's give it for Joe. And his wife, Melissa's in the back with the Flight Attendants Union. She's a badass too. Thank you for being here. And we hope you're enjoying your time in New York City. Just a couple of housekeeping things. There are restrooms back there and over here, gender neutral. There are snacks. If you need water or a snack, some sustenance, there's here. And let's see, any other important. The charts around the room, if you haven't had a chance. We don't have a time for like a break, a movement break or anything allotted. So, but if you need to, do not worry about getting up quietly and doing what you need to do. So with that, a couple of things. First, we want to start with the land acknowledgement. And more than just trying to be, speaking about it, but just keeping it in our minds and hearts. We acknowledge that our work takes place on Munsee, Lenape, and Canarsie unceded territory. If you live or work someplace else, you can look up what lands you're on. We honor the indigenous and cultural contributions of the original inhabitants of this land. So here's kind of the flow for today. We're doing introductions right now. We'll hear from Joe Burns and follow with a short Q&A. Then from 2:40 to 3-ish, now getting through registration, we acknowledge takes some time. So we started a little bit late, that's okay. We'll have speakers from NISNUS, the Starbucks Union, MORE UFT, and RAFA, which is the rank and file action group within the professional the professional, staff union. Oh my gosh, I'm totally blanking. MORE's Movement of Rank and File Educators with the United Federation of Teachers. And then from 3 to 3:30, we want to have kind of an open discussion, do some announcements with each other, and then have a closing. We want to acknowledge all of the sponsors and hosts of this event. We have DC 37 Progressives, the DSA of New York City, Labor Notes, Haymarket, the Local 100 Fight Back, Movement of Rank and File Educators, Rank and File Action, and others. There's a New York City Public Sector Rank and File group that also sponsored. So if we didn't name you, acknowledge you as well in this space. All right, without further ado, I'd like to introduce Joe, who I don't know if Joe remembers this, but when Moore was in its infancy, we were probably like, if we were babies, like 2 or 3 years old. At the time, we invited Joe to come speak at our first State of the Union event in Brooklyn. He flew all the way, sat his words stuck with many of us who were novices who had just gotten into rank and file work, and the rest is history, right? We owe so much gratitude to people like Joe for doing the work, documenting it, helping us with an analysis while we get stuck in and working the day-to-day. Without that analysis, what are we doing this for? So, and also leaving space for the discussions to happen. First, I'm a teacher, so I'm wondering, what is class? I did this lesson with my 8 to 10-year-olds. What is class? 8 to 10-year-olds, and you can think about it for yourselves, they think of it as, well, there are people who make more money, and then people think they deserve more access to things, while there are poor people who don't have things and they have to struggle. So even at a very young age, children are gaining perceptions of what class is. They rise up to be part of the struggle as well. So I don't know if you know this, but what's considered middle class? Do people here consider themselves in the middle class? No? So according to the Pew Institute, middle class in New York ranges from basically between $56,000 to $125,000 income per year. I would disagree. Then there's a whole other study on the living wage, and there's a huge discrepancy there. So this is why it's so important to have people like Joe get down to what is real and true. So without further ado, I'm going to pass it over to Joe. Thank you so much.
Oh, sorry. Now you can hear me. All right. So just a little bit of background. I'm from Minneapolis, Minnesota. I became a hey Eric. I became a public health worker or a hospital worker in the late 1980s. Became my local president in AFSCME. Did a lot of strike support work in the 90s, a lot of the bitter battles like Staley and so forth, Detroit News. And then following that, went to law school. And for the last 20 years, I've been working with the Association of Flight Attendants, doing contract bargaining in the airline industry, pretty much full time. That's what I do is bargain. More recently, I've been general counsel of AFA. But along the way, I've written a number of books. And my first book, Reviving the Strike, I wrote it in the early, it was published in 2011. But back then, it's hard to believe now because everyone's kind of, embraced the idea that we need to develop a strike. But back then, during that period, no one was talking about striking. And it was weird to me because the strike is the essence of, sort of collective bargaining and trade unionism. So I argued that we needed to revive the strike. Then I followed that up with Strike Back, which was my book on public employees and how public employee unionism was based on a militant illegal strike wave in the 1960s. And we can learn from that and build, militant democratic unions today. But all of those were based, mainly on, sort of tactics, on reviving the tactic of the strike, talked a little bit about theory and used history. But, clearly in my book, Class Struggle Unionism, it takes a deeper dive into the set of ideas that we need that sort of underlie those forms of militant democratic unionism to rebuild the labor movement. We were just talking that, the statistics just came out that, despite all the sort of turmoil and ferment among the working class and the labor movements, stuff going on with Starbucks and everybody, union density just fell again by a couple tenths of a percent. So clearly the labor movement's in trouble. We only represent 6 out of 100 workers in the private sector. And, we've been stagnant or declining for a while. So it's time to take a serious look at our forms of unionism and to come up with a better way of doing it, because that's going to be key to reviving the labor movement and working class power in general. So let me just talk a little bit about class struggle unionism. So when I look back at the, first 100 so years of union history in this country, there's really, a big divide in terms of 2 basic forms of unionism. There's the business unionists. So if you think of the American Federation of Labor in the early 1900s, under Samuel Gompers, and the sort of, very narrow unions, they might be representing construction workers or skilled trades workers or the Railroad Brotherhood. And their slogan can be summed up like a fair day's wage for a fair day's work. They're fighting the employer, but don't really have a bigger vision of society in many cases. And often at their worst, the AFL was racist and exclusionary. Many of the constituent unions excluded African-American workers. Anti-Asian, racism was very prevalent in these unions. And they had a very, very narrow view of their role of society, that they're just representing their own and forget about everybody else. So that's and that's not just a historical artifact. I think that's something that's very much alive in today's labor movement. But in contrast to that, there was another vision of trade unionism, which is class struggle unionism. So when you think of the industrial workers of the world, leading like the Bread and Roses strike in Lawrence, Massachusetts, or a lot of the, sort of big strikes where they said, we're going to organize all workers and welcome all workers. You look at the 1920s and the Communist Party, at the time that the main labor movement was being wined and dined, by the employing class, they were out there with these bitter strikes, trying to fight their way through it. The 1930s upsurge, with a lot of that was led by, but led by the left, as we say. They built a multiracial unionism in the Deep South in the 1940s in the left-led unions. So anyway, there's a vibrant history of class struggle unionism, and just to go into what the key difference is, business unionists, fair day's wage for a fair day's work. Class struggle unionists, labor creates all wealth. Class struggle unionists look at the employment transaction and they say, hey, everyone has to go get a job at a certain point, unless you're one of the billionaire class or the capitalists. You're going to have to go get a job, and you're going to have to work, if not for one employer, then another. And what do all workers have in common? All workers, it doesn't matter whether you're a truck driver, a barista, a nurse, auto worker, you take the inputs that are allegedly supplied by your employer, and through the course of your shift, you exert labor, and your labor makes whatever comes in more valuable. And that's really, that's the key thing to understand. If you work an 8-hour shift, you're maybe only getting paid a fraction, well, not maybe, you're only getting paid a fraction of the value that you create. So that's why and how we have billionaires in society. That sort of transaction that happens in workplace after workplace around the country and around the globe. All that money siphons up to a small class of people. So then we end up with a society where unimaginable wealth goes to the handful, while the rest of the population, including those who create value, are fighting for the scraps. So class struggle unionists said this entire system is illegitimate. that labor creates all wealth, that we need to fight for what is truly ours, and our form of unionism needs to take that into account. And because they had that different viewpoint, it led to a very, very different form of unionism. So class struggle unionists, the business unionists see themselves as fighting for one narrow set of workers, right? They may be fighting for construction workers, and if they can get the contract to bid the Walmart, they don't care what the Walmart workers are going to make once they get in, and whether there's a living wage sometimes. The class struggle unionists fight for the entire working class. So that's why we fight for things like universal health care. That's why we fight against restrictions. We don't believe that workers all over the world are exploited. So obviously you're going to fight for workers, as opposed to the AFL up through the 1980s, the AFL-CIO, horrible positions on almost every issue, race, immigration, and so forth. Auto workers, fighting. They were more interested in, taking sledgehammers and beating up Japanese cars and establishing solidarity around the world. So that's a fundamental difference. But I think there's also a lot of differences in our day-to-day unionism. The United Electrical Workers, which is one of my favorite unions that's still around today, they call it them and us unionism, that we understand that on every issue, we have irreconcilable differences between labor and management. And that's not what you'll hear in a lot of labor education programs, or, a lot of federal mediators. For those who've done bargaining, or state mediators, they'll try and do win-win bargaining. Well, there's no such thing. On every issue, I don't care if it's safety, classroom, I don't care what it is, our interests are different than theirs, and they come out in concrete ways in terms of how we bargain our proposals. But them and us unionism is also about an aggressive form of unionism. A lot of the business unionists go hiding away from fights. They don't want to pick fights. It makes their life harder, right? Class struggle unionists go looking for fights. We go into a workplace and we say, how can we sort of expand the struggle? How can we use this as building broader working class power by establishing a fight in this workplace? And I think one of the key differences is that, and I see this a lot, is, there's a lot of these progressive unionists who come in there, and in my book I talk about them as labor liberals, which I'll touch on briefly. But it's this whole sort of idea that it's all about just kind of raising the wage rates and stuff, but they forget about the workplace struggle. But this goes way back to Karl Marx, the theorist of the early stages of capitalism in the late mid 1800s, where he looked at the question and said, well, we're talking about work and your work shift being exploitation, but I think employers understand if they can make you work twice as long, 12-hour days, 16-hour days, if they can make you work twice as long during that work shift, then they can double that rate of exploitation that they're doing and the work that you're getting out of your labor. And for that very reason, these sort of workplace struggles are some of the key struggles that we see within trade unionism. I mean, all I do is bargain work rules in the airline industry, and we know that the real money in the contract is not whether you get like a 2 or 3% raise or whatever it's going to be, or 10% even. The real money is in the work rules, and if management can take away your work rules, they can gain tens of millions of dollars. So anyway, class struggle unionists, we have these sort of sets of ideas. We're very suspicious of the role of the government. There's a lot of folks in the labor movement who hang their hopes in terms of reforming the NLRB, or we're going to get new Labor Relations Board officials because we elect the Democrats, and that's going to change stuff. But we see as a continuity of what actually happens is the labor board being used to repress labor struggle, and that's not just an accident. It's because one of the primary goals of government, if you look at this system of how and why we have billionaires, one of the big roles of government is to hold in place this system that allows the billionaires to operate. So when we talk about labor struggles, where successful labor struggles may have to stop production and people do plant occupations, you do mass picketing, then you see the role of the government is to come in and keep production flowing. You saw that with the railroad workers strike, right? For all the talk Biden did and all the officials, at the end of the day, their primary interest was keeping transportation flowing And it doesn't matter if there were inhumane schedules for the railroad workers, because the government has an institutional role in this. So anyway, those are all kind of the big points. I'm doing a little time check. Those are all the, so those are some of the ideas that we have as class struggle unionists. I'm going to touch briefly on one other facet, and then I'll go through a little bit about how we apply this. But I started doing labor work, sort of in the mid 1980s. And during that time, there was actually, we didn't think there was a ton of struggle, but there actually was, looking back. There was relative to now, there was a high level of strike activity. A lot of it was rank and file led. These locals and these, that had contracts for years and years, and management was coming in and trying to destroy the pattern bargaining, where everyone in industries would be paid the same, like meat packers and so forth. The newspaper printing industry, pretty much Greyhound workers all across the board, right? Trucking. And management is using all the tools that they had under what I call the system of labor control, the system of labor laws under which they operate. And it really led to some pretty bitter strikes. And I think for us on the left of the labor movement, the question at that time was, how do we create a labor movement that's capable of violating labor law? How are we able to stop production? How can we expand strikes when we've got a whole system meant to particularize labor disputes? So at places like Hormel and, and the meat packers and J. Main, the paper workers, I think local unionists are trying to break out of this system and figure out how we actually win. But there developed a sort of different view, and I call it labor liberalism, that was based among a lot of the staffers of unions, folks who had been leftists in the 70s, kind of rose their way through the labor movement, and they adopted a form of unionism that wasn't business unionism, right? Because they broke with a lot of the worst practices of business unionism in terms of the racist exclusionary positions, the failure to want to organize. And when you think about SEIU in the 1990s, that would be an example of that, and the New Voices with John Sweeney that developed. But so they had a lot of good, and they did some great work in that regard. But at the end of the day, they didn't really break with business unionism fully, and they developed a form of unionism which was better in a lot of ways, but also as bad as or worse in other ways. They created, they gave up the whole shop floor struggle, many of them, created these locals that might stretch all the way from Florida up through New England. In one local, like, how are you actually going to have any influence as a reform movement or as a local, as a local activist within those? They, in many ways, when you think about the Fight for 15 or some of those things, while a lot of the stuff they did was good, on the other hand, a lot of the stuff kind of abandoned the workplace struggle, that's at the core of traditional trade unionism, more so in even business unionism than that form of unionism. So in a lot of ways, and they also, had this idea that developed of like these staff organizer, staff researcher maestros. They were going to be the people who are the smart, savvy corporate campaign analysts who could come in and separate and substitute themselves for worker militancy and power. And guess what? It didn't work, and it can't work, and it won't work. So part of it, in terms of embracing class struggle unionism, is also saying, hey, this labor liberalism has run its course. It's been, I would say, the dominant sort of trend in labor analysis when you read like Working in These Times or Jacobin even, or a lot of these other publications where we've seen labor writing. A lot of these, what I call labor liberals, those ideas are sort of the prominent ideas. But my friend Chris Townsend from the ATU, or retired from the ATU, he always said the left must lead, So he talks about that in terms of ideas and labor. So, we need a labor movement where sort of left-wing class struggle ideas come to the forefront. And I think that applies in a whole number of ways. It means that we need to reorient towards the importance of rank and file caucuses and union democracy being at the forefront of what we see as important. It's not that we can't be, I'm on staff, we can have staffers and play an important role, but we have to have a reform-minded sort of idea that the labor movement, I could go from A to Z throughout the labor movement and the national unions, and they're incapable of leading a worker upsurge. It's just, you look at the auto workers, trying to lead the, GM strike, and in the midst of this corruption scandal that has the last three national leaders in jail, right? Or, well, they should be in jail, but I think they spent some time. So anyway, so we need a form of unionism. How are we going to revive an effective strike? Like we have to have a strike. I have a chapter called Class Struggle Tactics, but we cannot have an effective strike in the private sector if we don't have the ability to use solidarity and stop production. We cannot have the widespread revival of the labor movement if we can't do that. So how do we create a labor movement that can do that, rather than trying to, create a labor movement that limps along within the current system? So those are some of the questions. They're not easy answers, but that's actually the same sort of questions about how do we build a class struggle union movement, or how do we build a movement capable of violating labor law. They're very much overlapping sets of questions when we think about it. And it's both through the public sector and the private sector, okay? We talk about class struggle organizing. I've been doing a lot of thinking about it because I'm writing an article on it. And, how does class struggle, a lot of time has been spent on organizing techniques. How do you organize? How do you go talk to people? How do you map workplaces? And a lot of, time has been spent on that, but it's really a sort of, I don't agree with the framework. It's not like a class struggle framework. Class struggle unionists really, they think about how do we transform our unions into fighting organizations? How do we create the space so that workers can engage in fights with management? They understand that class struggle is inherent in the workplace. And you don't need outside organizers, often outside middle-class organizers, to tell workers to fight. You need unions that are willing to fight, and you need to help build the space to have those fights. So that's why, historically, a lot of the left-wingers, who did trade union work, they had to organize, and they were great organizers, but they also had a program to transform the labor movement, to reform the labor movement, but also to put the labor movement on a fighting basis. So I think those are some of the, sort of key concepts that we're going to have to embrace as a labor movement. A lot of times, I think as Gio was talking about, like myself included, we're doing the day-to-day, we're doing the bargaining, we're doing our union reform work, we're doing what we're doing. But at the end of the day, we need to, sort of popularize and develop a trend within the labor movement that says we need an entirely different type of labor movement. And, I'll just close it that there's, sometimes, I talk about all that's bad. It can be a little downer, but I think one of the good things is, if we do this and when we do this, it's very hopeful, right? So when you look at the Starbucks workers, where some folks on the left, they did some organizing and they managed to win a shop, where they won the election. But you see how once workers, there's an old slogan: when workers take a notion. When the workers at Starbucks themselves decided, hey, that makes sense for us, let's do it. And they started, self-organizing in a lot of situations around the country. And then you see that's how big movements grow. That's what we saw in the 1960s. I talk about that in my book, Strike Back, a fair bit, where, hardly anyone was in public employee unions, but when they started to embrace the idea, started out with the New York teachers here, doing a one-day strike back in 1960 and followed up in 62. But when they took that idea about striking and they embraced that and they had a fight within their unions, millions and millions of workers got into motion. And that's how we build big movements, and that's how we build a working class movement in this country. And it's based on, I think, good organizing, but good organizing based on, sort of solid class struggle principles. Anyway, I know we got some questions or the next part of the program, but thanks for taking the time to listen.
All right, just so you know, how many people have the book and have read through? So there are quite a few people here who don't have the book, and Peter Lamphere over here ordered from Haymarket, and there was a problem with the shipment. So yeah, UPS management, boo, shame. But what they did offer was a QR code. Peter, do you want to explain that really quick?
For attendees of this event, you can scan the QR code that's on the wall there. There's another copy at the book table. You get half off on the book when you order it from Haymarket. So please also pick up Joe's book on Strike Back that's at the table. Noah can help you out with that. And that's $15. So.
Just wanted to share that because I know that people are like, okay, we need to read this book because there's so much more. And there are certain lines in the book that just strike me, right? Especially in New York where there's a Taylor law and you're a public sector union and your union bureaucrats tell you, we have the Taylor law, it's illegal. But what Joe's talking about is going deeper than that and looking out to each other to say, we're actually in this together. And we have to build a militancy across all of our working class, quote unquote, middle class, to say we're willing to break the law, period. And there's no such thing as an illegal strike, and that becomes the frame. So yeah, with that, we'll take a few minutes to take questions. Like I shared in the agenda, there's gonna be a panel, and then we'll have time for more discussion. So, but right now, wondering if you've had some time to think, process, and something connected with you, maybe you read the book, and you have a question that you'd like to pose, and I'll bring the mic over. Yes.
Yeah, sure. My name is John Ferretti. I'm a member of a 40+ thousand subway and bus worker union in New York City, known as TW Local 100. And we've been practicing class struggle unionism before we had that term on a book. We're socialists. And we've been building a rank and file caucus within the union over a long period of time, decades. And as you know, it's very hard. And as you know, it's a very uphill battle. But during COVID, we kind of learned a lesson as to exactly how hard it can be. We lost 173 transit workers to COVID-19 during this crisis. So when you put up this question about business unionism being a problem in my union, it's a problem because my coworkers are dead, okay? And their families died. And our communities died, and we are still facing that struggle. And so I've heard a lot about you build a rank and file caucus, you win an election, then the rank and file's voices are heard. What do you do in a union that deliberately uses the death and sickness of members from COVID-19 to deny their right to vote in their own union elections by the thousands? You know how many workers voted in the transit workers election last time in 2021? Something like 8,600 out of 40,000 workers. When your union leadership is so in bed with the boss that they will deny your right to vote, that they will ruthlessly suppress your rights, and they will chain you hand and foot to the bosses, what does class struggle unionism mean in that context?
No, look at those are, certainly, powerful words about what happened with the workers there. I think that the struggle, I think one of the things that's been downplayed in recent years is sort of the need and the depth of the need to reform our unions, and it's a difficult challenge. And when you look back at, I think in the 1970s, in terms of the left in the labor movement, thousands of radicalized students go into the labor movement, and I think the New Directions Caucus kind of comes out of that period and that sort of mindset. And they went into the labor movement with an idea of class struggle unionism. And what they did was, they organized workers to get in to directly fight the boss. They did reform movements, but they had a very, very different vision of the labor movement. And part of what I think is sort of transpired over recent decades is a lot of that sort of disappeared. You still have some of these caucuses that exist longstanding. That would be one of the few ones. You have Teamsters for Democratic Union, but a lot of the reform movements kind of waned. And then I think what a lot of people said is the labor movement's so screwed up, we're just going to do things on our own. We're going to go form, these independent unions. We're going to do worker centers. You're going to do all these sort of different tactics. But at the end of the day, we still have a labor movement, and it has power, and it has the ability to deal with issues. So we need to really sort of revive this sort of idea that we need to transform our unions. But I think what we've also learned over the years is it's not just a matter of electing new leaders, because many times the leaders become, the same conditions that created the former business unionists. Once you get in office, that creates you. So you have to, sort of structure yourself. So if you look at what CORE does, in Chicago, where they didn't disband, they ran for and won, control of the CTU, Chicago Teachers Union, but they didn't disband their caucus. They kept that alive because I think they understood that you have to constantly be, having a voice for the rank and file. So I don't think there's easy answers. It's one of the hard things is being a union reformer. Folks get attacked, you get called names, you get, a lot of stuff. But at the end of the day, it's really the key hope for us as a labor movement.
Thanks, Joe. Yeah, and just to add, it's telling because in New York City, we saw that with the teachers union, or just like in education with the nurses, in every sector where the bosses, and I'm talking union bosses, just didn't give a shit, right? So what that means is we have to care about and work together. And so I'm grateful for that. Anybody else? I think we have time for okay, I'm gonna go over here.
Hey, I'm Navruz, member of UAW 2325. I have two questions. One, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about, so you just mentioned how often when people get into leadership positions, the same conditions that create the business unionism might transform their process, their thinking. I was wondering sort of how you keep yourself rooted, being staff, being in bargaining, how you keep yourself rooted in the rank and file struggle, that thought process. And I guess sort of related to that, how you decide to make that jump in the first place from sort of more organizing side to going to law school, going into bargaining.
Yeah. So, I work for the Association of Flight Attendants, and, there's very few unions I don't think I would last working on staff for, frankly. AFA has a pretty democratic structure, probably one of the more democratic structures around. They have, the right of, at any point, members can initiate recalls of their officers at all levels of the union. Fairly, staff bargaining units get to pick their negotiators, can switch out their staff negotiators if they don't like them. So I think we have a lot of stuff in place. And then I think, because I followed the debates in DSA over the years on, staff and rank file and stuff. But I think we need a form of unionism that makes sense to all, sort of levels and positions within the labor movement. And I think class struggle unionism, it's a question of how do you relate to the members and how do you view it, both in terms of what's your practice as a bargainer. You don't do sidebars, without the union leaders and the committee, being involved in it. you believe in the members. A lot of people, I think, get cynical about the members, but I always tell them, if the members aren't behind you, look ahead, because that's probably where they are. A lot of people fall into this mindset, but normally the members are wanting to fight. So if we start talking about a strike vote and stuff, so I just think those are kind of important. And the other thing is, if you're going to be on staff, you have to be prepared to be fired. I mean, that should be like the number one rule. If you're a leftist and you take a staff job, that there's going to come times in your career, your tenure, that you're going to have to say, I'm going with the rank and file, and I'm going to do that. And if I end up getting fired, I end up getting fired. And I've had that certainly over the course of time, where we've had, internal conflicts in various unions. And it's just, I just think you have to be willing to do that. Because if you're not, then even if you have good ideas, you become part of the apparatus, because you're going to have pressure to say, okay, I don't care, this contract needs to be settled. And you have to be willing to say at a certain point, well, fuck you, we're not doing that, Anyway.
Yes. I'm going to actually go over there. Sorry. I'm going to go over here. I saw her hand first, and then we'll go around. Yeah, what I hear Joe saying is we have to squash white supremacy in our union.
Hi, I'm Kareem Raymond from the New York State Nurses Association. So I think everybody in the room knows that what we did a couple of weeks ago. But my question to Joe is, what role do you think education of the rank and file about unionism, about belonging to a union, plays in the building of unionism as a whole? And I ask that because during our battle, and we'll probably talk a little bit more about it, during our battle, we spent an inordinate amount of time educating one-on-one the members. But what role does education globally, on a whole, every single day, play in its rank and file?
No, I think that's a really good and important point, is that, I think that there has to be ongoing political education in unions, but a lot of times it either doesn't happen or it's based on the wrong set of ideas. So unions will set up meetings, they'll talk about their internal bureaucratic process. They may be trying to tie people into the, Democratic Party politics or whatever it is. But in terms of, frankly, discussions about, how does class work in society? How do our unions fit in society? What is the role of the strike? How do we do that? Whenever we're leading up towards a strike, we have to have a lot of conversation within our membership about, both education and conversations about, why are we doing this? What does it make sense? And have those sort of discussions within the work group. Because if people don't, because at the end of the day, strategies have to make sense to people, right? And a lot of times organizers, you're trying to get them to buy a strategy that doesn't make sense. And you're spending thousands or millions of dollars to get you to win this union election or do this or that, when the workers may be saying, well, is that really going to improve it? So I think you have to have, also a, sort of dialogue that takes place so that the organizers and the leaders are listening to the workers about what sort of strategy they want to do.
Thanks, Joe. We have one last one, and then we'll come back around after the panel.
Hi, good afternoon. I'm Albert Scott with the East New York Community Land Trust. I definitely like if you could share, give your insights and more or less the synergy on grassroots organization partnering up with unions to help enhance their goals and vice versa as it pertains to grassroots organization, because we both want the same thing, living wage, things of that nature. Where's that sweet spot, that synergy, and how we can be proactive so we can then truly build that movement, unions, grassroots organization, economic justice? Just want to hear your insights on that.
Yeah, no, thanks. That's a good question. And I think, a while, it's probably 5-10 years ago, there was a lot of talk in the labor movement about, sort of alt unionism and ties with community groups as being key. And it is. But I think a lot of times what that can mean is that the staff of the union sits down with the staff of a nonprofit, which may or may not be grassroots community group, and it may not be grassroots unionism. So a lot of times I've seen in the past where they develop a model where it's not really the workers and the community activists, the true activists getting together, but a lot of time it's like at the staff level. But when you look at the real sort of social unionism or the community unionism, that really develops at the membership level. I talk about in my book, Strike Back, I talk about in the early 1980s in San Francisco, where they had to develop this because the neoliberals were starting out, like Dianne Feinstein and so forth, way back then, and on an anti-union wave against public worker unions. So what one of the unions did there was they were organizing the workers at a housing project, but they teamed up with the tenants, and the tenants went out on a rent strike at the same time that the workers went out on strike, and then the union leaders came back and said, "Oh, we've got a settlement," but one of the members stood up and said, "Well, what about the tenants?" And they said, so then the workers stayed out on strike until the tenants won their demands too. So that to me is like a true social unionism, And I think we can get a lot of other examples of that, but it's really driven by the members. And I think you see it during strikes, that a lot of times the members have ties to the community and they end up going out to their community. And we think it's something that has to be imported, but the members live in the community. And anytime I've been in a strike meeting where you're talking to them, they're like, "Hey, I know that person, I know my church group and stuff," and that's how we truly develop it. Thank you.
Thanks, Joe. And with that, Joe, we're going to ask you to kindly take a little break for yourself. Okay. Take a little water break and all that. Thank you so much, Joe. So we're going to move next to our panelists from NYSNA, from Starbucks. So I'm going to set up chairs. Meanwhile, you guys can... Can you hear me? Okay, great. So we'll hear from NYSNA because I don't know if you know, but they just came off an amazing strike. Too large. I'd be like, if you went out on the picket line with them, can you just raise your hands if you were there present? Amazing. That's what solidarity looks like. Whoop, whoop. And pass it over, Judy.
Well, hi, everyone. We're glad to be here, a few of us. I think one of the things, what everything Joe said really resonated with us. I think the thing that happened to us is we had a really unfortunate situation 4 years ago where we were sabotaged. There were a lot of nurses willing to go on strike at the time, but these liberal people that were having a lot of control of our union pretty much squashed it. So there was a lot of energy and demoralization at the same time in most of our local areas. Now, our union is a little different. We have in the state 153 contracts with all the different bargaining units, and they don't always negotiate at the same time, and we certainly don't negotiate together. We did try to do sort of a little bit of multi-employer bargaining the last 2 times, and it really was the boss's idea, I think, and it worked. It wasn't very effective. So this time we negotiated on our own. I work at Montefiore Medical Center. It's in the Bronx. It's a mega academic medical center that's been buying. We serve a poor population, but they're very wealthy, and it's a major academic medical center, and they're basically buying up lucrative places in Westchester and all over the place so they can make money and exploit the people that they care for. So we had a fairly developed and militant workforce, but they were so blown away and demoralized, they really hated the union after the last contract because they wanted to go on strike and they wanted to fight back, and they were held back. So we had to, took us 4 years to rebuild that, and those of us who were in leadership in the local union, because in our union also, the rank and file are very much involved in negotiations, at least in our particular local. You can kind of invent your way. We did have 3,500 members, but because of the cuts, we were down to probably about 2,700. And we had 3 main sites and a home care facility as well. So we had a lot of different sites, and we were very atomized, and clinics, and very hard to organize on that level. But what we did was we had a negotiating committee that was, about 13 of us. We absolutely agreed that we'd reach consensus and not have a vote whenever possible, and we did that. And there was so much love in the room toward the end. We were really on the same page. The other thing that happened is we had really done a lot of work, our own hospital, and I think they had done the similar stuff at Mount Sinai, maybe not to our extent. We were the 2 hospitals that held out and did go out on strike. So what happened was we were in touch with our members. We developed the whole structure of contract action team. We called them CATs. And in the CATs, they had their own kittens, and then we had a few tigers. So we really had some real militant work. We fought the boss every time. They wanted to do Zoom negotiations. We demanded on site. We won that, claimed a victory. People would come to negotiations. We also had Zoom negotiations. So we had a hybrid so people could participate and hear how disgusting the boss was. That was a big deal for us. As opposed to saying, what's the union doing? Wow, how do you deal with these bosses? I would kill them. So that was very important. And things escalated and escalated. We had a huge strike vote, but historically the union had strike votes and never went out on strike. They used it as a bargaining chip, but we were really clear. And at some point, we always knew this, but it became really clear to us, the negotiating committee, that members wanted to go out on strike. They wanted to go on strike because of the abuse. They wanted to go on strike because we weren't going to get what we wanted, and they wanted to go on strike because they were really angry, and they wanted to go on strike because I think deep down we knew that we needed to teach the hospitals a lesson. And we were very much in touch with our members at that point. And at the last 24 hours before the strike deadline, the boss started throwing things at us, like everything. You're floating thing, you're this, you're that, here, take this. It was like Trump throwing the paper towels in Puerto Rico. Here, take it. And we were like, oh my God, what are we gonna do? What are we gonna do? And we all said, we know the members want to go on strike, and we're going. And then we had a strategy to get people off the floor because we work night shifts. We had to have a strategy how to make sure everyone got out. And so we divided into 2 teams, those of us who were stuck like late, just dealing with the dynamics, and then the team that came in the middle of the night, like around 4 a.m, to start getting people out, and we had prepared people. And when they came out, they took over the streets, in my hospital anyway. They took over the streets, and people were just, it was incredible. And of course, what we knew would happen was people recognized being with each other and being out there and knowing that inside they were dying. There were some problems with patients, but the bosses were dying. The managers had to start taking care of patients. They didn't have enough scabs. We hardly had anyone crossing the picket line. We were still investigating how many, but very, very few. And they couldn't get enough travelers, and they were in deep trouble. So the nurses were just like, by the 3rd day when they just boss started caving in, and we were in touch with Mount Sinai behind the scenes. So our team and Mount Sinai were on the phone all the time. Oh, they're giving you that? Oh, you're giving them that? Why aren't you giving us that? Oh, you're giving them that? Why aren't you giving us that? Oh, you want to be the only one out? Oh, you want to be? And we kept doing that. And then the middle of the night, we all settled with, we got the enforcement and the ratios. They had the money. So we said, oh, you better give us the money. And they said, oh, you better give us the ratios. And we all settled at the same time. We were like timing it together. It was so cool. So that's stuff you might not know about. But anyway, the nurses wanted to stay out. They were like, wait, I was going to bring barbecue tomorrow. What are you talking about? I had my raincoat ready, like this was fun. So, obviously the enforcement of the real contract is going to be a big issue, but we're going to continue to develop, and we have classes already scheduled and people dying for classes. So.
Yeah, talk about, like in Joe's book, about bringing the bosses to their knees. That's what you did. We need to all do that. All right, up next we have Taffy, and I'll let you introduce yourself.
Hi, everyone. My name's Toffee. I am a barista at a unionized location in Williamsburg, the Williamsburg Reserve Starbucks. Um, I'm also a recent graduate from union semester at the School of Labor and Urban Studies. I guess just a little bit about my background. I came from a very working class background. My mom was a union member in the Postal Service. I'm a first generation college student, and I think my demographic of young, sort of like overeducated, downwardly mobile is was a really big part of why the explosion at Starbucks happened. A lot of young people who know that they deserve more being faced with, like this veneer of progressivism, but not actually getting anything real. And I thinking about the Burns book and this idea of like the militant minority, I think that sort of organically came out of that, and it's really exciting to see. And also just the fact that socialist ideas are a lot more popular with younger people now, which Burns also talks about. Like, it's not as taboo to talk about politics anymore. And it's been really exciting to see things like DSA becoming more popular, seeing DSA people out on picket lines, seeing a lot of solidarity between different unions. Like, there were a ton of different unions showing up to picket lines for like the roastery in Manhattan, and at my store as well. And that kind of like cross-union solidarity, I think, is really important to show that it's not just about Starbucks as like an individual store, that we're all in this together. And I will say, like, there's a line in the book where it Joe talks about not romanticizing going into the rank and file work, because there's this history of educated young people taking these jobs and then ending up either in like grad school or taking like a staffer position. And those are both things that I've considered myself. Like, I see myself as part of this larger history. These things are very tempting. Like, once you have the ability to get like a paid staff position or go into higher ed, there's stability there. And like Joe was talking about, there has to be this sense of being able to risk things. Like, whether you're rank and file or staff, you have to have this sense that you're willing to give up some level of comfort and risk what you have so that everyone can have better. And that's a really hard thing to develop. I'm in America particularly, just like the individualism is so strong. And it's really hard in jobs like Starbucks because the turnover is really high. People don't see themselves as like in a workplace that they're going to be at for a long time. And so getting that commitment, I don't know what's happening with the mic. Getting that commitment from people when they don't have a larger vision, they don't have like a political vision of what it means to stay in the fight. Like, it can't just be like fighting for your particular shop. Like, that's important. Like, the workplace issues and the shop floor are essential, but it has to be connected to a larger vision. Otherwise, people just get burnt out and they don't see a reason to be a part of the fight, because to them the fight is temporary rather than something that is going to be ongoing for the rest of our lives. Yeah, I think that's pretty much what I had to say. I don't want to go on too long because I know we have limited time, but.
Okay, I can be done. My name's Jerry Martini. I'm a staff member at the CUNY Grad Center and a member of the Professional Staff Congress, which is the union that represents staff and faculty, both full-time and part-time within CUNY. CUNY, sorry, acronym, City University of New York. And I'm a member of Rank and File Action. One of the things that, I mean, there's so many things that I could just say, wow, this really was amazing. Joe nailed it. I could say tons of stuff like that. One thing that really have left me thinking that maybe is what I should talk about today is the pieces about being a public sector worker, because he does note several times in the book that a lot of it is really focused on private sector work. And then he teases us at one point about, like, you can read more about public sector if you buy my other book. So I'm glad to hear that it's here today so that I can get it on the way up. But one of the things that is, I think, really key here is the class struggle union and the billionaires versus the rest of us piece. And for those of us in the public sector, one of the reasons why labor liberalism, I think, is very appealing to many of our comrades, even our lefty comrades, perhaps, is that we, especially if you're a more reformist socialist bent, our labor is paid for through taxes, and we want public things to be paid for through taxes. So it's very easy for our leaders to say, it is so important for us. It is the most important thing for us to fight in the realm of electoral politics. That is incredibly appealing. And it's very important then that we highlight some of those other pieces within the class struggle unionism as a way to ensure that we're not falling into these traps set. Things like democracy, that the working class is capable of making decisions, of liberating itself, right? I can't tell you how hard it is to see lefties who are constantly making excuses for why all the decisions are made by a few people, when we are fighting for a liberatory society where lots of people get to make lots of decisions for themselves. And I think it's especially true in higher ed, where people love to be, everybody is an expert, right? They got into academia because they are an expert about something. They have a lot of respect for people and their expertise. So I think those things that Joe highlights about how tempting it is to sort of feel like, well, there are experts who know a lot about bargaining or about how to win better than the last person did when they were dealing with Democrats. That is so tempting to believe, especially when you're somebody who is predisposed to say, yeah, we're all experts in something. Let's leave it to the experts and we'll kind of go along with what they've got to say. I think that also the giving up the shop floor thing is something that all of us have to really think a lot about. I'm going to just give an example because it makes me both really happy professionally, but sad as a labor unionist. On my campus, there was recently a campaign to have a vote of no confidence in the president. This campaign was led entirely by people. You read the reasons why folks wanted to get involved. Hundreds and hundreds of people signed the letter. All of the reasons are about labor. Nobody got involved with the union chapter to put forward this vote of no confidence thing, because they saw it as, even though it's so intertwined with labor, it was something they were going to go through professional governance, through the this grad council to get it passed, right? We joined on later and have pushed it, and I think it's so inspiring that this happened. It was really a groundswell of people who were fighting for conditions in their workplace. But we as a union, and I say we, I've been an activist on this campus for a while. I'm at fault just as much as anybody, right? They did not see the place to fight for their workplace in our union. they said they did it someplace else. And I see that as like, that's a real indictment of us. It was really uplifting, a lot of it as a staff member. It was great to see all these faculty who had a bunch of things saying, and one of the things we're really mad about is how they're treating staff, because a lot of times staff kind of feel forgotten in university settings. But it was really like, it was a moment where I was like, wow, we don't have the shop floor. Nobody even thought to come to the union, even though this was entirely about labor issues. Anyway, I know I've probably spoken for more than my 5 minutes. I have so much great stuff to say. The labor liberal thing, we were talking about this. Some folks that went to Labor Notes, we had all just read this book before we went to Labor Notes, and somebody was like, did you get inside of the minds of some of the people in our union here, Joe, when you were writing this? Like, were you interviewing them? And I think, honestly, the thing that really stuck with the one line that stuck with me the most was maybe the beginning of the 3rd chapter or something like that. Like, the hardest fights are the ones with your friends. And I think that this is where we're really going to have to sort of articulate these differences and find a way to, there are friends, comrades that we need to really bring along and say, like, it's not just about having people who say that they're in favor of these progressive things. It's about people who want to restructure the union and our society. And that takes a lot more than just, we're all on the same page with what we're saying here at the, publicly.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Martina Meyer. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm a member of the Moore Caucus of the UFT. I'm a proud unionist and a proud public school educator. And more, just for folks who might not be aware, we're the opposition caucus. There are a few other caucuses within the UFT. We're the largest opposition caucus. And our membership ballooned during the pandemic because our union was sitting on the sidelines and like watching a terrible thing occur and watching its very own rank and file members putting their lives on the line while union leadership started to work remotely and meet with us remotely while we were in the building. And it felt a little disingenuous for sure. So we are fighting we're fighting for a more transparent and democratic union. So right now, you may know that most of I think all public sector unions right now are in the midst of negotiating with this mayor who is an austerity mayor, who we endorsed, by the way. The UFT endorsed this mayor. We also endorsed Governor Hochul. So that's where our union dues are going. We're going to endorse candidates that are basically just promoting privatization of our healthcare, privatization of our school system. They're promoting conservative judges, as we've seen, and it's really up to like the people to push back upon this. So we are the people within the UFT. We're the people, and we're pushing back by demanding more transparency. We have folks in the room right here who are part of the 500-person negotiating committee for the UFT's contract with the DOE, which sounds like a really great big number. Those 500 people have to sign an NDA so that they don't disclose to their own union members what they're negotiating. So just think about like how much distrust there is right there. Like, we don't trust our own union members, our siblings, to share what we're talking about, what the boss is saying, what we're going to come back with. Like, we can't share our strategy publicly. Also, there's 124,000 active members of the UFT. So having a 500-person negotiating team is actually a tiny fraction of the folks that should actually be engaged. Most of the 124,000 active members of the UFT are unaffiliated. And so that's the work that Moore is putting most of its energy into, is organizing the unorganized. So just like to use a little example of something that, to be honest, some incredible folks, including Gia, Noel, folks that are in this room right now, really fought for. We had close to 400, mostly women, employees who were summarily dismissed on September 6th. They're the early childhood instructional coordinators and social workers. And these folks are there to make sure that students get what they need. If you can imagine, especially after a pandemic, these people are essential at all times. But these little people are coming into school for the first time after, these are the pandemic babies. So like they really, really need the support of these instructional coordinators and social workers. And due to budget cuts, due to like bargaining chips at the secret negotiation table that we don't get access to because the non-disclosure agreements. So we saw these folks as being like sacrificial lambs to the bigger like, okay, y'all can get raises, but we're going to get rid of this position, and we don't support that. Our union leadership did. Like this dismissal, this accessing could not have occurred without the union leadership okaying it. And the response from the chapter leaders that's like our equivalent of shop stewards, the chapter leaders of those instructional coordinators and social workers was, well, Mulgrove's really busy. He's like the mayor and he can't be concerned with something like this. So, there's not really much that we can do. And that's a really typical response. That's a response that we get a lot about. If you might know, there's like a class size law that's happening, and we want to put teeth to that law inside of our contract negotiations. And the response from our union leadership is, there's already a law about it. Don't worry about it. It's going to be okay. I'm sure everything will be great if there's a law about it. There's a law that everybody has to get the services that they need if they have IEPs or they have if they're new arrivals to our country, and that law is not being followed. There's a law that every single school has to have a librarian in it. That law is not being followed. So what is it that we think will happen if we have a law about class size reduction? It's not going to get followed. So it's really up to the rank and file to hold us accountable, to hold everyone accountable. So with these instructional workers instructional coordinators and social workers, we just parallel organized. People in this room met regularly with these folks, and we aired our grievances, and we analyzed what was happening, and we strategized, and we held rallies. And exactly what Joe Burns said happens. The members were not behind the UFT, they were in front of the UFT, and the UFT leadership, supported our rallies. And eventually it was announced at our most recent delegate assembly that it was successful, that they staved off the accessing and restructuring of this, the early child division, for a year. But that wasn't done by the UFT, that was done by the rank and file. That wasn't done by the leadership. That was the power of the people. So all that to say, like, this fight continues, exactly what Tafi's saying. Like, this is the solidarity that we have to have. And it's just reading this book really helped me to analyze as well. Like, the union leadership themselves are not in the same class as the workers. They are getting paid by their union. Within the UFT, they're getting paid also. They have jobs within the New York State Union. They have jobs within the National Union. And so when you add the thousands and thousands of dollars that each of these individual part-time jobs have together, we're talking about people who do not share our struggles. They don't have the same concerns. When our healthcare is getting chipped away at, and we're just being told, don't worry about it, we got you, we're gonna take care of you. They're not changing their own healthcare, they're changing their healthcare. So it's like, we have to see this for what it is, which is the people who say that they have our backs are like sitting comfortably at home while elementary school teachers were the first ones back in, and so it's like dividing and conquering within our own union, but also not acknowledging that the struggle is not shared by our leadership. And so we have to hold our feet to the fire and recognize that we are the unions, we dictate the terms, we hold the power, and we withhold the labor if necessary. So that's where we are. Strike, strike, strike. Strike, strike, strike.
Thank you for, can we just give them all a hand, including for Joe? And Joe, if you don't mind, I'm going to invite you back up to have a seat. Hang in there. I know we're a little bit over time. Let's hang in together and have a little discussion. There were hands up before. So before we get started on this part, discussion community agreements, I hope you will all agree that one will have one mic and use a progressive stack. That means that, raise your hand and I'll try to get you in the order based on representation in the room. And then to make space and take space. If you know you're someone like me and can go on and on, please watch your airtime and make space for others. If you're someone who speaks a lot, please step back. If you're someone who doesn't tend to speak up, you would like to, please do so, although we're short on time. Please speak from your own experience and share sources when possible. And again, watch airtime. The WAIT acronym is, many of you may recognize it. Why am I talking? But that's just so that we can respect each other's time in this space. So I remember there were hands over here and there were hands over here. So I'm gonna do my best to get as many, just to offer succinctly as possible, a question, offer an idea, thought. I saw a hand back there. Is that right? Okay, I'm coming.
Hi, my name is Eric. I work for the Labor Campaign for Single Payer, which is what it sounds like. We have a newsletter. I'm not paid on commission. I encourage you to check it out. So there's been multiple people that have talked about like individualism and like unions like kind of fighting just for themselves and maybe not for like the bigger picture. So working for Labor Campaign for Single Payer, I wanted to kind of like put that to like, what do you think about unions' roles, not just in like fighting, like Starbucks fighting for Starbucks workers or more fighting for U of T workers, et cetera, but like, you know, like we always credit labor for like giving us the weekend, giving us the 8-hour workday, et cetera. I would like to credit unions for like giving us guaranteed healthcare, but it's kind of like, it feels like too insular to me. And like, what are your thoughts about that? Because in France, they set shit on fire, you know, when they protest, right? So is it just capitalism? Is it just individualism? What do you think? Thank you.
Maybe one or two people, somebody can pass the mic. Thanks, Martina.
Hear me? Works? Yeah. So we're one of the few unions that has publicly been very active in supporting the New York Health Act. It's very lonely. In fact, from what we hear from the politicians, although we don't believe them usually anyway, is that the biggest obstacle are other unions, particularly the public sector unions. Their line is that the bill, they don't trust the government to manage their funds. They have good funds. They say, well, you know, we're not really comfortable with some of the stuff. It doesn't really recognize the gains that we've made. They give a lot of excuses, but in my opinion, it's because this is what they sell to their members. Since they don't do rank and file work in the workplace, they don't take on social justice issues to the same extent unless it's safe, like Fight for 15. And basically, I think they also have a big business going with their funds and control of the workers through their funds. And I think that's one of the big issues that that distills rank and file power, because people will say, well, I don't know if that caucus gets in, what's going to happen with my pension, what's going to happen with my benefits? These people know what they're doing, these new people don't. So I think it's a bunch of things, but I think it's really how they consolidate their power, which is really unfortunate. And some of us who have been in leadership in our union have tried to work with other unions and have forums and conversations, but I think they don't admit the real reason that they don't support this. And I think that then when Janice came, the public sector said, oh, if we don't provide the health benefits, then everyone's going to quit the union because of Janice. And you know, we keep saying we had the biggest union membership in the 30s when the big fights were total social justice fights and not individual fights. So it's a major problem. So anyone who has ideas on how we can build that, let us know.
I want to quickly respond. Like, our UFT actually did support the New York Health Act twice. We voted in our delegate assembly in 2015 and again in 2017 to endorse this bill, which is a bill in the New York State Assembly. And then our union leadership unilaterally decided that no, actually our union isn't, even though the highest decision-making body in our union did endorse it. It's actually not in our best interest, and we must not have known what we were really doing when we did endorse it. And so, you know, this is another example of business unionism where, you know, this is like the paternalism, the condescension toward our union membership and not trusting the decisions that are actually made. I mean, you know, if you can't trust the highest decision-making body in your union, then what is your union doing? So yeah, we're fighting within our union as well. And Joel and others are wearing a shirt that says our students are working. Our working conditions are our students' learning conditions, and that includes like the health that we have, the healthcare. If our students and our families are not healthy, then how can they learn?
Hello, my name is Luigi. I work in a UPS warehouse in Canarsie, and I wanted to make this question up because many times was brought the idea of a strike, and there was this chance of having the railroad strike. That was like a very, it's always encouraging. Like if that strike would have happened, would have changed the whole landscape in the US, and people brought, I don't know what's going on in France, the UK, that they actually are doing it. But this was diverted for the Congress, the Democratic Party, and some union leaders. So I wonder what is your take of any of you of the obstacles that is between organizing and the relationship with the Democratic Party and progressive people? Because in UPS we are set to strike supposedly in July, so we might fight some challenges too.
Just maybe you can help us find the box of books, Joe's books that went missing.
Yeah, I think the railroad strike, the potential railroad strike, really shows a lot about the labor movement and the relation to the Democratic Party. It was pretty clear that the top railroad officials, did not want to strike, and also, I don't think really wanted to challenge the Democratic Party. And, a lot of people, kind of have covered for them and said, oh, well, it's, the Railway Labor Act takes away the right to strike. And they were just following. That's all bullshit because, I've bargained under the Railway Labor Act and I've studied the history, and even the conservative unions in the 1920s didn't give up the right to strike. All they agreed to was that it could be delayed by the government for a total of 60 days. And what they've done over the years is they've kind of, enacted a stranglehold where they've done this. But this time, in past ones where they've passed legislation, it's been like, maybe to extend the cooling off period, or it might be after they've gone out on strike to either impose arbitration, all of which are bad enough. But here, months before you have a deal, you've got top administration officials saying that they're going to impose a contract upon the workers. I mean, what sort of impetus does that give management to negotiate a deal? I think this is one more example that was driven by the ranks and by Class Struggle Unionists. Railroad Workers United for years has been, trying to pull together all railroad workers and organize on a rank and file basis. But I think and this goes back to the healthcare question. I mean, one of the problems is, you talk about the problem with the labor movement being captured by the Democratic Party. And it has a lot of problems in terms of waste of resources and so forth. But I don't think we recognize that the Democratic Party is a party that's funded primarily by the billionaire class. And that, when we talk about the union leadership being more interested in tailing the Democratic Party leadership, that's really an entree for management's ideas into the labor movement. So when you look at teacher unionism, and how these neoliberal ideas really kind of pervaded the national American Federation of Teachers, and them going along with charter schools and all of that, and them more privileging their relationships with Democratic politicians than the teachers who they're supposed to be representing. So I think that's it's a fundamental that we have to break with the Democratic Party, not just because we need a labor party, but also because we need to get these management ideas out of our labor movement, and we need to just excise it and be able to move on. Okay.
I mean, as I mentioned, since I'm in higher ed, I feel like it's so much easier for people to fall into this trap, or because we're public sector, it's so much easier for people to fall into this trap because of the funding issue. And it does seep into the way that we talk about this so much. We had in a labor management meeting with the president of the college, when we were bringing up an issue and they were like, we don't have any money to fix this. But if you guys as a union want to fix it, why don't you just work on electing better Democrats to office so that we have more money as a campus? So the president of the school was essentially using the same language that we hear labor leaders use. I mean, I will say I've heard folks tell us the most important thing that we can do is go to lobby days in Albany. The most important things that we can do is get people to sign the petitions that go to lawmakers. I had somebody say that if you're not donating money to Vote Cope because you're concerned about where that money's going, that your logic is the same logic that Janice used to tell you that to sort of shame folks into voting Cope. So I think we have to take a much different approach. And I think we see, like, if there's a lot of educators in the room here, the thing where you say two nice things before you say something bad to your, when you're giving feedback on a paper. Every time we see, with Hochul, it's like, here's a couple nice things we're going to say she put in her state of the state, but she didn't actually give us any money for education. It's like, well, that's the important thing, right? That's the thing that we want to highlight here. I mean, we haven't seen a statement from the PSC about LaSalle, the appointment for. When I asked about this to the delegate assembly, we were sent something that the AFL-CIO said, but of course that gives the union itself cover by not saying anything, right? The AFL-CIO, they represent everybody, public and private sector. So with the public sector waiting to hear what kind of funding we don't want to come out and publicly say that we're opposed to this anti-labor judge that she's going to appoint. Anyway, sorry.
Thanks. I'm going to pass the next question.
Hey, I'm Ben Douglas. I'm a member of Left Voice and former Teamster until I got fired for my union activism. I wanted to question for Judy and Joe. First with Judy, I think the nurses' strike that just happened was really, really inspiring and really important. And I wanted to know sort of your sense of the response of the nurses that did not participate in the strike, if they are inspired, if there's a discussion going on in the union about the strike, and what sort of possibilities might exist for a broader, like, citywide nurses strike next contract. And then Joe, I wanted to ask you about your view on how class struggle unionism sort of broadly intersects with specifically like what I call like the self-organization of the workplace, or the rank and file, building rank and file participation, direct union democracy. And just to contextualize this, like the 1934 Teamster strike, you're from Minneapolis, there was like a 100-person bargaining committee, democratic, mass meetings, and like we contrast that with, the Teamsters of the 70s, but even the Teamsters today, there's relatively little direct member self-organization. And so how do we build back the sort of member-driven aspect of class struggle unionism and not rely on just militant leaders that are going to hopefully call a strike?
Go to Judy first.
Hello? Yeah, I was so interested in what he was asking you. I forgot what he asked me. So, yeah, people who didn't go on strike, many of them were very supportive of those of us who did, very inspired. In fact, there was a shop election in Long Island the day that we went back to work, which was very close because the boss was being very repressive. And we think it was all the publicity that we got. We won that election. We got 800 new members that day. It was so weird. Like the angel of labor was watching and said, settle the strike, have the election, you'll win. So people were inspired. About what happens next time, it's difficult. We have different dates that contracts expire. We don't expire at the same time. We do have a group that's going to expire at the end of this year, and we're already starting to try to organize there. When I say the we is a very interesting word in my union. But I think that one of the things that we have to do, because we have these local sort of structures, I know when we were talking about the politicians, you have to keep people reminded. The workers were very clear that the government was working with the employer, because as we were about to go on strike, the governor came out with this. Well, the bosses were all going crazy. So please help us. They can't do this. So the governor says, I will ask for interest arbitration. And the employer said, before she even made the public statement, they said, yes, we agree. We think that's a wonderful idea, and especially since they're going to go on strike in 7 hours. And we were like, what? And then we had to find out, like, can that happen? Of course, some of us thought we knew, and the answer was no. And we said, oh, we're not going to do that. And the members were like, what? Governor Hochul? Didn't our union endorse Governor Hochul? What a horrible thing that was to do. And they're just working with their bosses. And when the politicians came to the rallies that we had, who had never said a word in support of us because they all get money from the hospital, they're all giving us, yeah, we support the nurses. And we kept saying, Vanessa, and help us, help us. We don't want to just hear words. So I think building on what people learn in a strike is really important to bring those broader political questions out. And I think that was what Kareem was talking about with how do we educate our members when they say, oh, they're working together, and then saying, well, this is not just for us. This is always. These are the people that get the money, and that's why they do. So will we be able to have a strike in 3 or 4 years? I think, it happens whenever the contracts expire. We'll try to have that fight. But clearly the nurses who did go on strike are energized and aware in a way that they never have been, and we really do have to build on that first. And I think when we model that, what we're able to get beyond that, and what we got in our contracts, and what we got in our solidarity, and what we got in our ability to fight back on the shop floor, in the workplace, on every unit, because that's really where it happens. And if we can do that, and we can do it better and more, I think it'll be a model for more people.
Yeah, I mean, so I think it's one of our tasks, right, as Class Struggle Unionists, to expand the fight and to expand the sort of direct worker conflict and participation in our unions and our battles at all levels. So I think it really depends. I mean, most strikes that you either read about or you've been part of, there's there's the battle with the boss, but I think there's often a battle within that about control of the strike, and what's the rank and file's participation. Do you return to work? Do you not return to work? At the end of the day, if you look at a good chunk of the strikes, you look at the strike wave of mini wave of production workers, at John Deere and Nabisco and GM and all of that. A lot of those strikes happened not because the union leadership wanted them to, but because tentative agreement after tentative agreement got voted down. Certainly, you think back to some of the big, strike battles. You have rank and file committees coming forward, and just as in the 34 trucker strike, but more recently, 90s, like Staley and so forth. These road warriors coming together, and people coming forward and starting to keep the battle going when the national union may not be willing to do that. So I think that's a common feature. If you're in union leadership, I think it's easy. The problem with these progressive ideas is they get co-opted, so like bargaining for the common good, now even probably the national AFT is in favor, everyone can be in favor of it, but are you truly in favor of it? You know what I mean? Are you tying it into workplace demands and expanding teachers' power? It's like expanding the size of the committee. Now that if that's the sole criterion, then they can put a bunch of people on the committee. But, at the end of the day, I've been bargaining, and, the strongest committee is like you got 2 or 3 people, because then the staff have no power because they just decide, you know what I mean? So they can do a lot of these sort of, if it's just a question of doing these sort of tactics or organizational changes, the union bureaucracy is really good at adapting to them. What they're not good at doing is giving up power. So I think, and those are fundamentally different things. So I think our task is always to, like, how do we push the power back, out of the staff and push it back to the rank and file, or fight for it. If you're at the rank and file level, how do you fight for it?
That was a mic drop. Yeah. All right. I think you had your hand up again.
Yes, just real quickly, for the unions, just curious, do you have any internal mechanisms on how you connect with maybe the local organizations within your community, and how you engage it? and how effective is it, and what does that look like during the middle, the beginning, and the end leading up to the strike to help galvanize and support?
Actually, I'd like to call on my two coworkers, my two colleagues, to talk about this, because we had actually a people's tribunal with 17 community organizations prior to the strike about charging the hospital with like crimes against humanity, pretty much. And I think Vanessa, who was dealing with the Nurse Family Partnership, can give you a lot. And Karine, we did a lot of community back work because we, just like teachers, they take care of students, we take care of patients. And I don't know, your working conditions, our working conditions, our patients' care conditions, I guess, same thing. But I think they led that struggle in an incredible way, and I'd really like Vanessa to, I know I'm putting her on the spot, but go Vanessa.
I don't like it. I'm shy. I'm very shy. Okay, so my name is Vanessa Weldon, and I've been at Montefiore for 22 years. I've been a home care nurse. I've lived in the Bronx for all my life, so it was very important to me. There was a program that Montefiore has had since 2015, which is the Nurse Family Partnership Program. And the program was set up so that way it was to help high-risk mothers, first-time mothers, and we followed those mothers and their babies through to the baby turn 2. And the program was really vital because, you know, these programs served mainly minorities, and they are the highest risk of infant mortality, which is within the Black and brown community, and the mothers. And then all of a sudden, this year, they just decided that they were not going to fund this program anymore. It was partially grant funded, and Montefiore covered half of it as well. And they just decided that, you know what, oh, the fees is going up, it's $800,000, and we're just not going to fund it anymore. You know, but yet these mothers were still turning up to the emergency room because they couldn't get appointments to see their clinicians, and they were turning up to the emergency rooms and they were dying, they were stroking out. And this is a preventive program, so it just really infuriated me that you would have billboards all up and down 95 where you're paying hundreds of thousands of dollars for billboards. You have commercials, but you will not fund these programs. You will not help to try to help move the health inequities of these people. It's really frustrating. So we got to the community, and the community got behind us. And we went to the community and we said, this is what is happening within our community. This is what Montefiore is doing. But Montefiore would like to start Hudson Yard, a program in the Hudson Yards where it's millions and millions of dollars, but they won't fund this program. And they won't keep these mothers alive. They won't keep these babies safe. And it's just not appropriate. And the community backed us. And then we went to the politicians, like Judy said that day when we had our speak out, and the politicians got, what are you going to do about this? We're bringing this to you. How are you going to help us keep our mothers and babies safe in this community? So it's really, really important that we keep this program going. So we were able to get it into our contract because we made it part of our proposals that Montefiore needed to fund this program. You needed to make these mothers safe. So we were able to get them to put it into our contract for 1 year, and then they did say, well, we will work to see how we can get the program and keep it funded. So that is our next fight. We are still fighting to keep that going.
And Vanessa was not trying to talk about it. Like, whoa. Anyone else?
So I don't know if you realized this summer, but the mayor cut our education funding because even though we have a budget surplus and we have billions of dollars of federal aid still on the table, we needed to cut our education budget. Just for the record, so it was projected to be $469 million. It actually, the total difference is closer to $900 million. And the mayor and the chancellor didn't cut the bureaucratic budget like they said they were going to. So they actually exceeded their bureaucratic payroll by $100 million. But I'm here in a classroom being told that my students can't get the speech therapist or the occupational therapist that they need because there aren't enough to share among the schools. And so they're trying to negotiate how we can and make up the missed hours. They're just trying to negotiate that. And you don't get a do-over with kids. Like if you're missing, speech therapy, like it doesn't magically happen by itself. Like that's why we have speech therapists, because the students need the intervention. And time passes, and we can try to figure it out bureaucratically, but it doesn't. This kind of work and the advocacy that we want to do is not within a bubble. And so our work is out of necessity tied to the experience of parents and other educational activists. So every month we have a panel for educational policy, which is the New York City Board of Education in essence. And we collaborate, our caucus collaborates with a lot of different parent organizations to be militant and active within the PEP area. And we also collaborated with a lot of amazing parent organizations to fight against these cuts over the summer. We also are in the most segregated school system in the country still. And our union just doesn't talk about it at all. And so we partner with Integrate NYC, youth-led organizations. So, very much in the spirit of, how Joe is saying, you can't look up for leadership, you look across, and across means across all sectors and also across all roles. So to educate a child, as you know, it takes a village. We have to engage the village. We need to really get everybody together. And when we see how interconnected, intertwined our struggles are, our class struggles, when we see that, we fight for each other and we show up. And that's what happened. Parents show up for us and we show up for parents. I would love for us to strike, and I have great faith that the parents would show up. We love to say the S word at all of our union meetings. And as we come, we have cat teams too, and we had a cat training, and the first thing that we talked about, caucus members were speaking up saying how these union rights were won through strikes. So yes, definitely bring back the strike, and with the collaboration and support of the community, including in our context very much the parents and the students, those big kids, those high school kids, they show up for their teachers. They really do.
Thanks. So we have time. I'm looking at the time. We have time for one more question back here, and then unfortunately we end. But we're here until around 4, and maybe mingle, talk about what we can maybe do to stay connected after this. But here's our last question.
Thanks so much. So I'm afraid of the feedback. There's tens of billions of dollars in the coffers of organized labor, and people talk a lot about how those resources can and should be mobilized for organizing, and of course that's true, and it's a shame they don't do more of that. And whatever extent those of us with our perspective can push for that, we should, and we do. But I lead my small federal sector local at the Army Corps of Engineers here in New York. And I'm constantly thinking about ways to use whatever, legitimacy, influence, resources that I might have access to, and through my influence might be able to leverage others to do with their resources, influence, et cetera. And beyond direct organizing, which of course is important, and yes, we should push for, I'm constantly coming back to the question of what kind of other really political initiatives can we, through the labor movement, pursue that can have cascading effects beyond the direct impact of putting resources into organizing? And so I'm in the construction industry, the building sector in particular, and we have all of each industry, of course, has its particulars. But I do think there's a generalized version of this question, which is, without industrial unions in any meaningful sense, workers aren't going to be able to influence industrial policy, let alone the full economy and whatever the big picture goals we might have. And the question that the Starbucks worker raised about the political perspective that we provide that helps sustain people through the troughs of struggle. I wonder, I know there are socialist organizations, there are a number of independent organizations that help provide that kind of perspective for people, but what vision, what industrial strategy, what industrial organizations outside of and in addition to our unions can the resources of the labor movement begin to facilitate? Because in construction, climate change is obviously this massive thing that nobody's meaningfully engaging with through our unions. I mean, and I'm sure there's exceptions to that. I don't want to overspeak, but in a sector that's so conservative, where, to the example that Joe gave, where construction union leaders will build anything as long as there's a 6-month contract for its workforce. So like, how do we use the resources and build a vision of industrial policy without yet meaningful industrial unions?
Okay. All right. So, I mean, I guess you can go sector by sector, right? And construction unionism, you can take that, where the Business Roundtable got together in the early 1970s, and management in general was concerned about the falling rate of profit, or I guess you can debate that, but they really had a concern about work rules and the cost of buildings, so they got together and strategized on a national level about how they could bust the construction unions and make the union go virtually non-union, that sector, and they were quite effective of it over the years, and they used not just straight up, bust and strikes. But a lot of it was using the corporate form and shifting and hiring non-union contractors. And we get to today where, residential is basically non-union throughout the country, and construction unions exist based on, the small portion of government grants that they can get, or prevailing wage, So you basically, and you can go sector by sector, where the sort of deunionization policies happened, and so how do you combat that? So I don't personally believe that it's mainly a question of getting some sort of sector policy or policies that we're going to be able to do. I think the problem is that the form of unionism we have in, you can go sector by sector, doesn't work, and it doesn't make sense. So the reason that teacher unionism floundered, for about 15, 20 years is because it was wrong. It was because the national unions and the local unions were promoting, tailing behind the neoliberal Democrats. They had abandoned the strike. They had abandoned the concerns of the teachers and the community. So I think they could argue on these policy levels, but at the end of the day, they needed to get their union back into shape. And then once they do that and they get the rank and file there and they start striking, then they have a lot more influence on, things like testing and all of those issues that you're trying to deal with. I think similarly, until construction unionism fundamentally, adopts a different model, it's going to continue to flounder. And the problem is, we don't see that. We see them trying to do value-added unionism, trying to show that they can compete with the non-union firms or competing with, it's a race to the bottom. So, and I could go on and forever, but you could go industry by industry. But I think that, we need, when I look back, so, folks are quoting William Z. Foster, who was the, head of the Communist Party organizing in the 20s and 30s. And people are quoting organizing methods in steel, like the Amazon workers were looking at that. And, and it's good they're looking at that, but that was a piece of what he did. It was like a sliver. And most of what they talked about was, what is the program for our union in this industry or in that industry? For railroad workers, it's amalgamation, get everyone in the same union. It was fight the Railway Labor Act, or they called it the Parker Act back then. So I think we could do that, and we need to do that industry by industry and say, what is, what should auto unionism look like, and what does it look like for manufacturing unionism to come back? And I think once we develop strong unions, then I think we're going to have more influence on national policy and so forth. Or how can we do a green transition? Our unions are so weak that we don't even, have control to be able to do it. So anyway, that's a long answer to that, but that was a tough question. So
yeah, thanks. Round of applause for everyone, for yourselves, for being here. Deep breath. We have a couple of announcements, so there's more, there's always more. There's a book club coming soon in the spring, if you're interested. There's a bit.ly bit.ly, and you know how it's all case sensitive. So there's a / uppercase C, LASS, uppercase S for struggle, uppercase S for spring 23, and Peter. Yay. QR code. Sign up on the laptop. Strike Back books are here. Like I said, UPS did not deliver the box. I'm hoping Luigi can help us. And thanks. And now you're going to hear some music. If you want, please take the snacks. I wanted to deliver water to you guys. I will do that in a moment, but I will say, please, if you feel so compelled to stand up, we're going to sing together. Okay? I know people are looking awkwardly at each other, but
solidarity forever, solidarity forever, solidarity forever, for the union makes us strong. When the union's inspiration through the workers' blood shall run, there can be no power greater anywhere beneath the sun. Yet what force on earth is weaker than the feeble strength of one? But the union makes us strong. Solidarity forever, solidarity forever, solidarity forever, for the union makes us strong. It is we who plowed the prairies, built the cities where they trade, dug the mines and built the workshops, endless miles of railroad laid. Now we stand outcast and starving mid the wonders we have made, but the union makes us strong. Solidarity forever, solidarity forever, solidarity forever, for the union makes us strong. They have taken untold millions that they never toiled to earn, but without our brain and muscle, not a single wheel can turn. We can break their haughty power, gain our freedom when we learn that the union makes us strong. Solidarity forever, solidarity forever, solidarity forever, for the union makes us strong. In our hands is placed a power greater than their hoarded gold, greater than the might of atoms, magnified 1,000-fold. We can bring to birth a new world from the ashes of the old, for the union makes us strong. Solidarity forever, solidarity forever, solidarity forever,